Shaquille. Big Shaq O'Neal thought he was calling an old friend, but the voice that answered wasn't from the past. It was a warning from everything he chose to forget. A young black girl picks up and says 10 words that unravel a truth buried in silence. Behind one missed call lies a legacy erased, a woman silenced, and a city built on betrayal. What if the hero they praised was the shield they used to destroy her? This isn't just a call, it's a reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. A routine Sunday turns into a memory Shaq can't shake off. The sun slanted across the floorboards of Shaquille O'Neal's private study, striping the room with thin gold lines as jazz murmured faintly from a vintage record player in the corner. It was one of those southern Sundays, quiet, slow, still, the kind of day where even clocks seem reluctant to tick. Shaq sat in a deep leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, flipping through a dusty black notebook he hadn't touched in years. The edges were frayed, the cover warped from humidity, the pages tinted with time. Most of what he saw was familiar. Numbers for foundation partners, retired teammates, cousins, high school coaches long past, until a page stopped him cold. Tucked in the upper left corner of the page, nearly faded beyond recognition, was a name he hadn't heard or thought about in over 20 years, Eleanor Triggs. The numbers beside it were smudged, but legible. For a few seconds he just stared. The weight of her name alone dropped a silence into his chest. He closed the notebook slowly, then opened it again. Still there, still real. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on knees, the record player's scratch now louder than the music. Eleanor. That name didn't belong to this part of his life. Not to the $1 million endorsement deals, the luxury condos, or the motivational speeches. She belonged to cracked sidewalks and red dirt, to West End afternoons, sneakers hanging from power lines, a protest sign tucked under her arm. She had been loud in her beliefs, unafraid of confrontation, the kind of girl who didn't whisper truth, she shouted it. But then one day, she was gone. Not in a funeral kind of way, not in a move to another state kind of way. Just gone. No calls, no explanations, just rumors that floated around like smoke with no fire. He'd asked about her once, maybe twice, and then let life swallow the rest. Now sitting here 2 decades later, 1,000 miles from West End, her name had somehow reached across time and pulled him back. He stood slowly, the chair sighing under his weight, and walked toward the window, holding the notebook like it might whisper something more. Outside, kids played across the gated neighborhood street, chasing a ball too small for how big they were. He could hear their laughter, but it felt miles away. He turned back, looked at his phone sitting on the desk, and hesitated. It was just a number, just a name. There were more important things to do, meetings tomorrow, an interview tonight, but none of that mattered right now. That tug in his chest wasn't letting go. He tapped the number into his phone manually, pausing once halfway through, thumb hovering above the screen. Then, with one breath in and no good reason to stop, he hit call. 3 rings. 4. Then a click. Silence. Hello? A young girl's voice. Soft, unsure, slightly hoarse like she'd been crying. Shaq's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He hadn't expected that voice. He'd braced for Eleanor's rough, unfiltered tone. Not this. Is this Mr. O'Neal? She asked again, quieter now. The way she said it wasn't fangirl curiosity. It sounded like confusion coated in grief. He cleared his throat. Yes. I'm looking for Eleanor Triggs. I found this number. The silence on the other end changed, tightened. He could feel it. She's my grandmother, the girl said, carefully. Then after a pause that made the seconds crawl, she added, she passed away 3 years ago. Shaq stepped back like the words hit him. His eyes closed. The memory of Eleanor's smile, the way she used to call him tall talker, rushed in too fast to stop. I'm sorry, he said. I figured someone would call eventually, the girl continued. You weren't the first name she expected, but she never erased your number. Shaq sat back down. The notebook was still open on the desk like it was listening. He wanted to ask questions about what happened, where she'd been, why he hadn't heard, but something in the girl's tone told him to wait.
My name's Renita, she said. She talked about you, just not often, mostly when she was tired, or on the porch after protests.
Protests? He asked. A pause again. Then you really didn't know, did you? Shaq didn't answer, because no, he didn't. He hadn't known anything. Renita exhaled like she'd been holding in a storm for years. She tried to keep going after everyone stopped listening, after the city moved on, but she couldn't carry it alone. Nobody stood with her at the end. Shaq rubbed his forehead, feeling something hollow open up inside. Guilt had a strange way of showing up, Not loud, not fast, but slow, seeping, like water behind a dam. She left something behind for you, Renita added. A letter. And something else. Said you'd come one day. Said maybe then people would finally care. The silence now was heavy. Shaq looked around the room. The trophies, the framed jersey, the honorary degrees, all those pieces of success built on a life that forgot where it began. He felt like a visitor in his own past. I want to come see it, he said. I figured you would, she replied. The line went dead before he could say anything more. Shaq stared at the screen. No callback, no message, just a missed connection suddenly reconnecting, dragging him back into a world he thought time had swallowed. He picked up the notebook again, flipping past pages of agents and endorsements. None of them mattered. Not now. That night, he packed quietly. No announcements, no press, no entourage. Just him, a black hoodie, and a ticket to a city he'd told himself he'd never return to. West End hadn't been on his itinerary for over 2 decades, but somehow, it was calling him louder than any arena ever did. As the jet rose above the skyline, Shaq stared out the window, the city shrinking beneath him. And in his lap, tucked beside the old notebook, was a folded napkin with her name written again in his handwriting. Eleanor Triggs. He didn't know what was waiting for him in the West End. Truth? Regret? Closure? But he knew one thing for sure. Eleanor had been more than a forgotten number. She'd been a buried chapter in his story. And now, it was time to turn the page. He expected familiarity, but the voice was young, broken, and haunting. The streets of West End hadn't changed as much as he hoped they would. Buildings bore new paint, but the same cracks. The sidewalks were narrower than he remembered, as if time had tightened them. As Shaq drove past boarded-up storefronts and hollowed churches, a tension built beneath his ribcage. Not fear, but shame's quieter cousin. He'd flown in under nightfall, trying to stay unnoticed, though his presence was never subtle. Even in a hoodie and sunglasses, he cast a long shadow, one that people still whispered about from behind cracked windows. The address Renita texted him had no zip code, no directions, just 139 East Milford. He didn't need GPS. He remembered that street like a scar. It ran parallel to the train yard, 3 blocks down from the basketball court where he and Eleanor used to argue about politics and jump shots. She always won the first. He always won the second. The house stood hunched at the end of a gravel driveway, the porch sagging like it hadn't exhaled in years. The steps creaked when he climbed them. When he knocked, the sound felt too loud in the quiet morning. Renita opened the door. Not more than 17. Thin-framed, dark-skinned with tightly coiled hair and a gaze that didn't blink. She didn't smile, didn't move. She looked up at him like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. You came, she said. He nodded. Come in. I'll show you. The house smelled like dust and lemon oil, the kind of scent that clings to old books and older secrets. Renita walked ahead, barefoot on wooden floors, her steps echoing down a narrow hallway lined with fading photographs. Every frame was a decade older than the last. At the end of the hall was a small sitting room with sunlight filtering through sheer curtains. A faded recliner sat in the corner. Next to it, a side table with a closed envelope on top. The room felt preserved, like Eleanor had simply stepped out and never returned. She used to sit here every afternoon, Renita said, her voice low. Sometimes for hours. Talking to herself, or to you. Shaq didn't answer. His throat had closed up the moment he saw the recliner. She wrote that letter 6 months before she passed, Renita continued. She told me to wait, not to call you, said if you remembered her, you'd find your way. He picked up the envelope. His name was written in blue ink, not Shaq, not Big Diesel, just Shaquille, the way only she used to say it. The weight of it in his hands was heavier than it should have been. She thought you forgot her, Renita said suddenly. Her tone was flat but firm. She didn't blame you, but she knew you wouldn't come back until something made you. Shaq sat on the edge of the recliner, still holding the envelope. The silence between them thickened. He looked at Renita, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying not to let her face betray anything. But the bitterness was there, small, controlled but deep-rooted. She was like a mother to me, Renita added. And you were the myth in every story. The one who left, the one who made it, the one who stopped calling. He lowered his gaze. She wasn't wrong. Why now? She asked, her voice cracking slightly for the first time. Why'd you call that number after 20 years? He exhaled. I don't know. But he did know, he just didn't have the courage to say it. Because somewhere between signing endorsement deals and shaking hands with governors, he'd buried her memory beneath layers of success, of safety, of privilege. He had outgrown West End, But maybe he'd outgrown something else too, the truth. He opened the envelope. The paper inside was thin, lined, written in the same neat script Eleanor used when they were kids passing notes in class. The ink was smudged in spots, and the folds were worn. Dear Shaquille, if you're reading this, it means you finally let the silence bother you. Took you long enough. I don't write to blame you. That was never your sin. You were a dreamer. I always loved that about you. But dreams can blind a man if he ain't careful. You left to escape the weight. I stayed and carried it. They tried to silence me, said I was too loud, too black, too woman, too angry. They whispered things, spread stories, took everything except my name. But I held on to that. I watched you shine from a distance, cried at your Hall of Fame speech. But I never stopped wondering, would you still remember where we came from, if it didn't have a spotlight? Renita is strong. She's fire and steel. But she needs to see that not every man walks away from the fight. She needs to see you, not the one on TV, the one who used to run with me through alleyways, past burning dumpsters and crooked streetlights, talking about changing the world. If you've found this, maybe that boy still exists somewhere in you. And if he does, don't leave again. Your sister in arms, always. Eleanor. When he finished reading, he didn't speak for a long time. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. He could feel Eleanor's voice in every word, unyielding, honest, brave. It was her, fully. Renita sat on the floor across from him now, knees tucked under her chin. She waited. Every year she waited for your call, even when her voice got weaker. He leaned back, the recliner groaning beneath him. His mind reeled with images. Eleanor at marches, Eleanor shouting through megaphones, Eleanor walking alone when no one else would stand beside her. She had never been anyone's token. She had been a storm wrapped in skin. She ever talk about why she stopped calling me? He asked, his voice raw. Renita nodded slowly. They made it hard. Some people here. They made sure her voice stayed small. The more she spoke, the more they shut her out. Phone lines were cut. Mail stolen. She tried. Then one day she stopped. Shaq looked at the envelope again. And she still didn't hate me. No, Renita said. She pitied you. That hit harder than any insult. He looked up, and for the first time saw the sadness in Renita's eyes soften. It wasn't forgiveness, but maybe the start of understanding. She thought you could still do something, she added. Not for her. For the ones still here. The ones still choking on the smoke of what this city did to her. He stood slowly, letter still in hand, and looked out the window at the neighborhood beyond. It was cracked but alive, struggling but moving. There was something breathing underneath all the decay. Something that hadn't given up yet. I want to see where she marched, he said. Renita's eyes searched his, like she needed to be sure. Then she stood too. Then you'd better wear shoes you don't mind getting dirty. And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving him standing there with Eleanor's voice echoing in his head. Shaq had come back expecting closure. Instead, he'd been handed a torch. A neighborhood buried in stories finally begins to speak. The road into West End had always been uneven, a metaphor wearing asphalt. Shaq remembered its rhythm like a beat. The rise and fall of tires over fractured pavement, the sudden dips that could swallow a rim, the turns that always seemed narrower than physics allowed. Yet today, as the rental car crept slowly through these streets, he didn't feel nostalgia. He felt like an intruder, like someone who had trespassed into the past without an invitation. Renita rode quietly in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the houses passing by. Most had paint curling from their edges like the skin of a sunburn. Roofs sagged. Yards lay bare except for the occasional rusted bike or broken plastic chair. But there were still signs of life, laundry strung between porches, laughter echoing faintly from behind chain-link fences, the thump of bass from someone's cracked stereo. This wasn't a place that had died. It had simply adapted to surviving. Stop here, Renita said, pointing toward a squat brick house with boarded windows and a sunken porch. Shaq parked by the curb and followed her to the steps. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The smell of wood rot and old newspaper rushing out like a memory too long sealed. The house had once belonged to Eleanor's sister, now abandoned, she said. But there was something inside Renita needed to show him. They stepped over splintered floorboards and crumpled insulation. Dust coated everything in thick silence. Renita led him to the back room, a space barely lit by a window sealed with duct tape. She knelt near the corner, pulling up a warped piece of floorboard with careful hands. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic and bound with twine, was a small tin box. I found this last year, she said. Didn't open it at first. Didn't feel right. Shaq crouched beside her, his massive frame nearly filling the room. The box clicked open after a second of coaxing. Inside was a folded letter, a faded photo of Eleanor, and a much younger Shaq, and a press clipping yellowed with time. He pulled out the letter first. Renita stepped back as if giving him space to grieve in advance. He unfolded it, and there it was again, his name written with deliberate pressure, Shaquille. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, and the creases had worn thin, but the words were clear. You won't read this when I need you to. That's the first truth I've had to accept. By the time this reaches you, the city will have moved on, and so will you. But maybe this letter will outlive both. Shaq sat back on the broken floor, reading in a silence so thick it stilled even the breeze through the walls. They used your name to silence me, to shame me. Every time I spoke out, someone brought up how you left, how you made it, and how I couldn't even keep a job at the school after speaking at the protest. You never said anything, and maybe you thought silence was safety, but your silence became a weapon in their hands. There was a night, you don't know about it, I tried to reach you, called, left messages, wrote letters. One of them I gave to your old coach. He promised he'd get it to you. He never did. Instead, he told people I was unstable, angry, a threat to your image. They burned bridges with your smile as the match. I never blamed you. Not really. But I needed you to know what your name did here, after you left. I needed you to understand that your success came with a shadow. I hope one day, you read this and decide to bring the light back. Not for me, for the ones who stayed. There were no closing lines, no goodbye, just that a truth carved in quiet pain. Shaq stared at the photo next, their faces younger, freer. She was in mid-laugh, hand on his shoulder, both of them dressed in protest t-shirts from a long-forgotten rally. They looked like a revolution that hadn't happened yet. His jaw tightened. He could still hear the chants. Still remember the night Eleanor stood on a milk crate, calling out local officials by name while he held the bullhorn steady. Back then, he believed justice just needed volume. But volume without protection was a death sentence for people like her. And when he left, she had stood alone. What do you remember about that protest? He asked without looking up. Renita exhaled sharply. You mean the one where the school principal claimed she threatened him? Where the same night someone slashed her tires and the mayor's office stopped returning her calls? Yeah, he said. She came home crying that night. Not because they tried to break her spirit. She'd lived through worse. But because her own people stopped calling her back. The same ones she fought for. Shaq didn't speak. The betrayal in the letter was still echoing, still stabbing at places he hadn't known were hollow. She kept fighting, Renita added. Kept organizing even when they shut down her community center. She ran free clinics from her kitchen, tutored kids after they cut funding. She was tireless, and you were the ghost no one could touch. They'd use your name like scripture. Shaq made it. Why can't you be more like him? Like you were a cure for black pain. He winced. There was no defense, no correction to make. Renita stood and brushed dust from her knees. Come on, she said. There's someone you need to meet. They exited through the back, walking a narrow trail between overgrown hedges and broken fences. A block down stood an old brick laundromat converted into a makeshift community center. A hand-painted sign read, The Eleanor House. Inside were rows of books, flyers pinned on corkboards, kids playing chess in silence. An older woman with gray braids approached them, wiping her hands on an apron. This him? She asked, eyeing Shaq from toe to crown. Renita nodded. Shaquille. The woman didn't smile. You look like you finally got tired of pretending you were too big for the dirt you came from. Shaq dipped his head, humbled. I didn't know, he said. No, baby, you didn't want to know, she said. But you're here now, and maybe that counts for something. She handed him a folder filled with Eleanor's handwritten speeches, news clippings, photos of rallies, and school board records. It was a life spent fighting a system that had used him as a distraction. He sat at one of the tables, thumbing through page after page, feeling the weight of her life wrap around him like iron. One photograph stopped him cold, Eleanor holding up a letter in front of City Hall. The caption read, Activist claims local officials suppressed communication with NBA player. In her hand, unmistakably, was the same envelope he now held in his pocket. That was the final twist of the day. The betrayal hadn't just been abandonment. It had been orchestrated in silence. People in power, using his image as a tool to delegitimize hers. He hadn't just left. They'd made sure he never looked back. And now, sitting at a folding table in a makeshift center named after a woman he'd let down, Shaquille O'Neal finally felt the weight of his silence in full. Not every scar shows. Some are in the names you forget. The plaques on the community center's wall were small, inconspicuous, almost apologetic. Local donors, volunteers, alumni, names carved into brass that glinted when the sunlight hit them just right. Shaq's eyes scanned down each one, expecting to find hers. Triggs, Eleanor, Triggs, somewhere, anywhere. But she wasn't there. Not even once. He blinked and stepped back, looking again, slowly this time, as if he'd missed her. But all he saw were surnames of local businessmen, city officials, pastors, teachers, all who had once, at some point, shaken Eleanor's hand or stood behind her podium, and yet none of them had preserved her in the place built on her blood and bone. Renita stood at his side, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had stopped reacting to this kind of thing a long time ago. "She's not on the wall," Shaq said, like he needed confirmation of what he already knew. "No," Renita replied. "They said it'd be too divisive, that putting her name up might reopen wounds." She paused, as if the wounds ever healed. Shaq exhaled sharply, walking to the back of the room where more flyers hung. Youth programs, tutoring sessions, summer cleanups, sponsored by the city of Jefferson, in partnership with the mayor's council. His stomach turned at the irony. "Eleanor started this center in her kitchen," Renita said, her voice low but sharp. "It didn't even have a name back then. Just a place where kids could sit after school, get fed, learn something real, not the crap they were feeding us at Booker Elementary." Shaq nodded. She always hated that school. They hated her right back. She handed him a folded page, a grainy photocopy of a newsletter. The headline read, "West End organizer sparks unrest with radical youth program." It was dated 2 weeks after a peaceful march Eleanor led to protest the city's refusal to integrate new textbooks. That march, the one everyone in town remembered as a disruption, had been her last public event. She was blackballed after that, Renita said, slowly, quietly. They didn't drag her name through the mud all at once. That would have been too obvious. They just stopped inviting her. Cut funding, said her message didn't align with community goals. The same week, your face went up on a mural downtown. Shaq turned sharply. "Wait, my mural?" Renita raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know?" He shook his head. "I thought that was for the tournament, the one they named after me." "It was, but they painted over the mural that used to be there first. You know what it was?" Shaq didn't answer. A painting of Eleanor holding a book, with 5 kids behind her. It was there for 15 years. Then someone donated 20 grand for an athletic pride initiative. And poof, history vanished. Shaq felt the heat rising in his chest. Not anger at Renita, not at the mural, at himself. For never asking, for never noticing, for never wondering how a city could celebrate him so loudly, while keeping silent about the woman who taught him to speak. "She called you her twin flame," Renita added after a pause. "Said your fire just burned in different ways." Shaq looked away, unsure if he'd earned that kind of poetry. They left the center and walked the neighborhood. Renita led him down side streets he barely remembered, places that had changed names but kept the same bones. As they passed, people peeked through curtains or paused mid-conversation. Whispers trailed behind him like perfume. "That him? No way. He came back?" Children stopped playing. Dogs stopped barking. Even the wind seemed to hush. The weight of being seen, not admired, not celebrated, just seen, sat heavy on Shaq's shoulders. Fame had always been loud, but this was silent and sharp. They stopped in front of an old building that used to be the town hall annex. It had been converted into a warehouse, but the frame of an old dedication plaque still clung to the bricks. "She held her first town meeting here," Renita said. "They let her speak once. After that, she wasn't allowed inside unless it was as a guest on someone else's list. A black woman speaking truth, that rattled too many seats." "What did she say?" Renita didn't answer. She pointed instead to a burnt orange poster pasted to a telephone pole nearby. It was torn at the corners, faded, but still legible. "Education isn't a privilege. It's a right. Eleanor Triggs." Shaq reached out, fingers brushing the paper. It trembled slightly in the breeze. "They started calling her dangerous after that," Renita said. "They said she was trying to corrupt the youth, just because she taught black kids how to question what they read, how to ask why they weren't allowed access to the same resources as kids on the East Side." He turned to her, frowning. "And nobody ever told me any of this?" Renita's stare was as steady as a ledger. "No one wanted to, and you didn't ask." They returned to Eleanor's house as the sun began to dip. The front steps groaned beneath their weight as they sat. The neighborhood was quieter now, but the air was heavy with memory. "You know what's wild?" Renita asked after a long silence. "The mayor still gives a speech every year about diversity and progress, mentions you in it, but he's never said her name. Not once. Not even when she passed. Shaq's fingers tightened around the edge of the porch rail. How'd she die? Renita glanced at him, as if measuring how much truth he could handle. Heart failure. They said it was genetic. I say it was exhaustion. She looked out toward the street. She spent her whole life holding up a community that kept trying to drop her. Shaq let that sit between them. No rebuttals, no deflections, just the ugly, naked truth. She ever get any recognition? He asked finally. Even after? Renita shook her head. Not from them, only from us. Kids she mentored, families she helped, strangers she fed. We called her Miss Eleanor. But outside these blocks, they acted like she never existed, like her name was too heavy for their tongues. Shaq stood, unable to sit anymore. He paced the porch once, then twice. The letter from the tin box was still folded in his jacket pocket, its weight more present now than ever. I want to fix it, he said. Renita looked up. Fix what? The mural, the plaque, the stories. I want to make sure people know who she was. Renita didn't smile. You can't fix what they erased, but you can rewrite what comes next. The wind picked up as if to echo that. Shaq nodded. Then we start tomorrow. He was their hero, but what if he was also their coward? The morning after the mural revelation, Shaq stood in front of a mirror that reflected more than his face. He saw lines that hadn't been there 10 years ago, softness in his frame, and eyes that no longer blinked away ghosts. The luxury hotel he'd chosen, discreet, high-end, just outside city limits, felt like a lie. Like camouflage stitched in cotton and thread count, he stared at his reflection longer than usual, toothbrush still in hand, waiting for the man in the mirror to blink first. Who had he become? He stepped outside before breakfast, hoodie up, hands in pockets, and drove himself. No assistant, no camera crew, no smile. Just him and a silence that hadn't left since he opened Eleanor's letter. His first stop was Booker Elementary. The building had been remodeled since he last saw it. Now it had solar panels on the roof, a security gate out front, a new gym bearing his name, the Shaquille O'Neal Activity Center. That plaque was polished, front and center. But when he walked inside, no one knew how to receive him. A few gasped. One teacher dropped her papers, and the principal, a thin, bald man with a rehearsed grin, nearly tripped rushing out of his office. We weren't expecting. Wow, Mr. O'Neal. This is an honor. Shaq raised a hand, quieting the fanfare. I'm just visiting. He was given a quick tour, smiling kids, fresh paint, bright posters. It looked hopeful. But Shaq wasn't here for the presentation. He asked to see the archives. The staff looked confused. No one had touched them in years. They led him to a back room behind the library, where filing cabinets lined the walls. Dust floated in sunbeams. He opened one and began sifting through paper after paper. Board minutes, student photos, newsletters, funding memos. A decade's worth of bureaucracy stacked in silence. Then he found her. Eleanor's name appeared in a 2003 newsletter. Local parent pushes for curriculum reform. A smiling photo of her, surrounded by students, beamed from the bottom corner. But the article was short, almost dismissive, focused more on logistical concerns than her efforts. The next mention of her came 2 years later, a disciplinary report. Disturbance during faculty meeting. Vague, ominous. Then a termination note a few pages later. Shaq's jaw clenched. He flipped pages faster now, breath tightening. Eleanor's trajectory from respected volunteer to problem agitator was mapped out in administrative language. Sanitized oppression, paper cuts disguised as policy. And not once had he asked what happened. He walked out of the school without saying goodbye, got back into his car and drove aimlessly, letting the city carry him wherever it pleased. It led him downtown to Jefferson Square, the heart of the town's identity. The plaza had fountains, marble benches, and another mural, a newer one. It showed Shaq mid-dunk, the American flag ghosted behind him, children cheering below. There was no Eleanor. No mention of the marches she led through these same streets. No plaque, no stone, no painted fist. Just him, mid-air, like a savior caught in a freeze frame. He stood staring for what felt like hours. Eventually, a man in a blue jacket passed by and stopped. You're him, ain't you, Big Shaq? Shaq nodded slowly. The man smiled. We sure proud of you. You the one made it out. Shaq looked at him. What about Eleanor Triggs? The man's expression shifted. Confused, then cautious. She stirred things up. Good intentions, I guess, but you know how people get when they start shouting too much. Shaq's voice was calm. She taught me how to shout. The man chuckled nervously. Well, sure, But you found a better way. She didn't know how to play the game. Shaq turned from the mural. The words scraped against something raw inside him. He walked back to the car without another word, but his thoughts spiraled. They hadn't erased her by mistake. They'd erased her on purpose. And he, unknowingly, had helped. His absence was their alibi. His fame, their shield. By afternoon, he found himself parked outside an old building that used to be the West End Youth Library. It had been shut down years ago, now a storage facility for city documents. Shaq called in a favor, one of the few he was still willing to cash. The city clerk unlocked the doors without questions. Inside, the air was stale. Rows of boxes lined metal racks. He searched for 2 hours before he found the file labeled Community Relations 2004-2007. He opened it on a folding table under flickering fluorescent lights. Inside were memos, internal emails, complaint letters, meeting notes. His name appeared again and again. Our image with O'Neal provides sufficient cover. Suggest minimizing contact with Triggs to preserve partner relations. O'Neal's mural unveiling is scheduled for August. Delay protest permits until after the event. Triggs remains difficult. O'Neal's silence helps distance City from her rhetoric. Shaq froze. They'd used him, not passively, actively, as a buffer, as PR armor, as a tool. And he had let them, not because he agreed, but because he never looked. His success hadn't just come from talent or timing. It had come from silence, a silence that cost Eleanor everything. He closed the folder slowly, breath shaky, hands suddenly unsure. The shame settled in his bones, like cold in old wood. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind. It was the quiet sort. The kind that comes when you realize you were never quite the man you thought you were. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in Eleanor's old chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Renita found him there at sunrise, letter in hand, eyes red but dry. "You read it all," she said softly. He nodded. "They used me, and I let them." Renita sat across from him on the arm of the couch. "You didn't know." "I should have." She didn't argue. That hurt more. "I wasn't brave," he whispered. "Not like her. Not like you." Renita tilted her head. "You were busy surviving in your own way. They turned you into a symbol, and you thought that was enough." He looked at her. "It wasn't." "No," she said. "But you're here now." Shaq stood, slowly. "Then we change what's next." "Good," Renita replied, a shadow of something like trust in her voice. "Because you've got a lot of rewriting to do. Some streets are loud with noise, others with things unsaid." Shaq walked the streets of West End with heavy steps, as if the pavement itself remembered who he used to be. Not the man on TV, not the franchise name stitched into sneakers, but the boy who used to run barefoot past cracked sidewalks and broken hydrants, chasing laughter and borrowed time. But that boy had vanished, and in his place walked a man carrying questions no one wanted to answer. Renita had pointed him toward the people who remembered Eleanor not as a footnote, but as a force. They were the keepers of whispers, the ones who saw what the papers didn't print, the ones who hadn't forgotten how loud silence could be. The first was Mr. Boyd, a retired janitor who used to clean Booker Elementary back when Eleanor volunteered there every Friday. His house sat on the edge of a cul-de-sac with a porch that leaned like it was tired of standing. He greeted Shaq without awe, as if he'd been expecting him. "You finally came back," Mr. Boyd said, holding the screen door open. "Took long enough." Inside, the air smelled like old tobacco and liniment. Photographs lined the walls, most in black and white, all slightly tilted. Mr. Boyd poured 2 glasses of tea, without asking what Shaq preferred, then eased into his recliner with a grunt. "I cleaned up after her rallies," he said. "Not because I had to. Because nobody else would. City called them disruptions. Told the schools to log suspicious activity if they saw her on campus too often." Shaq listened without interrupting. "They never banned her outright. That would have made too much noise. So they found other ways. Locked copy rooms when she came by. Scheduled fake fire drills. Said her registration forms got misplaced. Bureaucracy's just a polite way to kill someone's spirit." Shaq nodded slowly. "Why didn't anyone speak out?" Mr. Boyd leaned forward. "'Cause the ones who tried either lost their jobs or their church donations dried up. And the police? They didn't need to touch her. They just needed to whisper." "Whisper what?" "That she was unstable. That she was stirring up young blood. That she had a temper." Shaq clenched his jaw. The same narrative Eleanor had hinted at in her letter, carefully constructed, passively spread. Mr. Boyd's eyes narrowed. "And you want to know the worst part? They did it using your name." Said Shaq made it out. Why can't she just teach and stay quiet? Like success was a permission slip to ignore injustice. Shaq lowered his gaze. That line had become a ghost in his ears. Next came Miss Audra, the aging pianist from Emmanuel Baptist, a church Eleanor used to attend before the congregation split in quiet protest. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee, but her memory was sharp. She played the tambourine in the youth choir, Miss Audra recalled, her voice tinged with melancholy. Used to say music was protest in disguise. She'd rewrite hymns to add verses about justice and equity. Got her in trouble more than once. She ever talk about being threatened? Shaq asked. Miss Audra paused, her spoon hovering over her cup. Not to me, but she changed after that last town hall meeting. Said someone followed her home, lights out on her porch, even though she paid the bill. Phone ringing but no one speaking. Then her mail started getting torn. And no one reported it? Reported it to who? Audra said. The same people she was speaking out against? Shaq didn't answer. He already knew. She wasn't paranoid, Audra added. She was hunted. Quietly. Like a wolf they didn't want to admit they feared. Later that afternoon, Renita took him to the basement of Eleanor's old home, a place he hadn't stepped into since he was 17. The air was cool and thick with dust. Boxes lined the walls, half-labeled, untouched. A broken bookshelf leaned near the back wall, and behind it, something glinted in the dim light. Renita reached behind it and pulled out a black boombox, the kind with dual cassette decks and a handle thick with age. She set it gently on a fold-out table and pressed play. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static. Then, a click, and a voice. Eleanor's voice. Clear, sharp, controlled. This is Eleanor Triggs. It's June 18th. I am recording this in case something happens to me. Shaq froze. His breath caught. Renita kept her eyes on the machine. On the tape, Eleanor continued, her tone unwavering. I had a meeting with Councilman Weathers this morning. He asked me to withdraw my request for police audit records. Said I was causing unnecessary unrest. When I refused, he said, and I quote, "You may end up erasing your own legacy, Miss Triggs. That would be unfortunate." A brief silence. Then she added, I am not suicidal. I do not own a firearm. If I am found dead, this was not an accident. This was a silencing. The tape clicked, rewound itself, stopped. Shaq sat back in his chair, stunned. The basement, once filled with childhood laughter and spilled soda cans, now felt like a tomb. That recording was never submitted, Renita said. She hid it. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of knowing it wouldn't matter. He stared at the boombox. Why are you showing me this now? Because you needed to hear what courage sounds like when no one's listening, she replied. That night, Shaq sat alone in his hotel room with the tape resting on the table. He played it again and again. Each time, Eleanor's voice cut deeper, her words sharper, her truth louder. They hadn't just buried her story. They had buried her warning. And now that he'd heard it, there was no going back. Sometimes closure opens more wounds than it heals. The chairs were set in a circle. No stage, no microphones, no podiums. Just metal folding seats arranged in a church basement that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old books. Shaq insisted it be informal, eye to eye, nothing elevated. He didn't want to stand above anyone this time, not today. The Eleanor house had offered to host the gathering, but Shaq declined. He needed neutral ground, somewhere without her name written on the walls, somewhere the guilty wouldn't feel cornered, at least not yet. The community bulletin went out quietly. Open dialogue on the legacy of Eleanor Triggs. No logos, no sponsors, no endorsements, just time and a place. By 6 p.m., the basement was full. Some walked in stiffly, adjusting collars, clutching purses, already preparing their defenses. Others came in hesitantly, heads down, not sure if they were welcome, but too ashamed not to show up. And then there were the ones who came angry, not at Eleanor, but at the weight of finally having to admit what they'd ignored. Renita sat in the back, arms crossed, chin lifted like a silent shield. Mr. Boyd was beside her, cap in hand. Miss Audra came too, hands clasped over a purse she didn't let go of the entire evening. A few youth leaders, a retired teacher, a former council assistant, the current mayor's aide, even the principal from Booker Elementary showed, legs twitching nervously. Shaq stood before them without ceremony. No introduction. Just presence. He looked taller in that cramped space, not because of his height, but because he wasn't hiding anymore. I came back, he said, because I finally listened. He held up Eleanor's letter. Several in the room shifted in their seats. I read her words. I found her tape. and I found the pieces of her life too many of us ignored or erased. The tension in the room twisted. She didn't just speak out, she was threatened, silenced. And the people in this room either helped make that happen or let it happen. A murmur rippled through the group. One man, mid-60s, polished, with gray at the temples and a smug calm, leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mr. O'Neal, this sounds like a trial." Shaq met his gaze. "No, trials have judges. This is just the truth sitting in a room." The man cleared his throat. "Then perhaps we should remember the time Eleanor disrupted our school system with her accusations. Her demands were not always rational." "She demanded books," Renita said from the back. "Not gold, not glory, books." The man looked her way, pausing. "I remember you, her granddaughter. I remember you too. You called her a danger to the children." "That's not—" "You said she was stoking rebellion, because she wanted us to know the truth about where we came from." A woman 2 chairs over, wearing pearls and a frown, interjected. "She had passion, yes, but sometimes she used it recklessly. Not everyone responds well to being shouted at." Shaq stepped forward. "She was shouting because you weren't listening." No one moved. The truth settled over the room like a fog. Another voice cut through, raspy, weary. "I worked in the council archives when she came by looking for those budget records. I was told not to help her." An older black woman turned to him. "You were told, or you agreed?" He didn't answer. Someone else, a young woman in city council uniform, cleared her throat. "We're working to restore her recognition. It's in progress." "Progress?" Renita echoed, standing now. "She died 3 years ago. We can't undo the past." "No," Shaq said, stepping between them. "But we can stop pretending it didn't happen." He scanned the room. "How many of you used my name to justify your silence?" More shifting. Eyes darted. Guilt, like smoke, curled up in the corners of the room. "I know what I became to this city. The success story. The proof of concept. But Eleanor? She was the part of the story you buried. Because she made you uncomfortable." Miss Audra raised her hand softly. "I don't want her name whispered anymore. I want it said." Mr. Boyd nodded beside her. "Say it loud. Say it fully." Someone in the circle stood up. Then another. One man stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "She was my teacher. When my parents got deported, she took me in for a week. I never told anyone. I thought if I did, they'd come for her too." More stood. Stories tumbled out. "She paid for my brother's SAT fees. She got my cousin into rehab. She helped my mama file a restraining order after the cops said it wasn't urgent. She told me I didn't have to be scared to be smart." And still, others stayed silent, unmoved, not cruel, just afraid. Afraid of what speaking now would say about their silence then. Shaq let the stories unfold. He didn't rush them, didn't command the room. He just listened, the way he should have years ago. When it finally quieted, he stepped forward again. "You can keep my mural downtown if you want," he said, "but it better be next to hers. Or take it down. I don't need it. She deserved it first." There were no cheers, no applause, just stillness and truth. And something heavy in the air finally exhaled. After the gathering ended, people filtered out slowly. Some stayed to hug, some left with their heads bowed. The pearl-wearing woman approached Renita near the exit. "I was wrong," she said simply. Renita didn't respond with warmth, but she didn't turn away either. Shaq walked out into the night, the air cool against his skin. It wasn't closure, not even close. But it was a start. A page turned, a silence broken, a name spoken not in whispers, but in reverence. "Eleanor Triggs." He said it aloud as he reached his car. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a legacy. Money doesn't clean blood from legacy. The morning after the gathering, Shaq woke to the sound of rain slapping against his hotel window. It came down heavy, southern rain, thick and relentless, pounding sidewalks like it was trying to rinse history from the streets. He watched the drops blur the skyline, turning the city into watercolor, all edges soft, undefined. It felt fitting. Yesterday things had sharpened. Today they dissolved. He picked up his phone, his mind already racing ahead. Damage needed undoing. Stories needed retelling. Names needed restoring. He wasn't just going to speak anymore. He was going to build. That's what he knew how to do. Build big, fund fast, cut through red tape. Money was the one thing that didn't wait for permission. By noon, his lawyer had drafted the paperwork. A $500,000 donation to the Eleanor Triggs Community Memorial. Another $100,000 to reinstate her old education program. Press coverage was prepped. Interviews lined up. It was movement, tangible, headline-worthy, legacy-reclaiming movement. But when he pulled up to Eleanor's house to show Renita, her face didn't light up. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring at the document in his hand like it was smoke from a fire she hadn't started. "You did all this already?" she asked. "I wanted to move quick, get the wheels turning," Shaq replied. She took the paper, scanned it once, then held it like something fragile. "You named it the Eleanor Triggs Legacy Pavilion." "Yeah, with a bronze statue in the courtyard. They'll place it in Jefferson Square. Full historical display. Interactive audio walk." Renita looked up at him, unblinking. "A statue?" He nodded, almost proud. "She deserves it. She deserved justice." The words landed harder than he expected. Shaq shifted his weight. "This is part of that. People will see her name, learn her story." Renita stepped off the porch, the rain now misting lightly around them, softening into a drizzle. She walked toward the front gate, the document still in her hand. "Do you think a plaque makes up for what they did to her?" she asked, not facing him. "I think it helps," he said quietly. "I think it's a start." Renita turned. "It's not, it's a shortcut." Shaq felt the sting in her voice before the words even hit. "I'm not trying to buy forgiveness." "No," she said. "You're trying to buy the discomfort away." The accusation stopped him cold. "You think they'll feel guilty when they pose for pictures in front of her bronze face?" She continued. "You think the mayor won't use that pavilion as campaign proof of progress? You think the people who silenced her won't bring their kids there on field trips like she wasn't a wound they helped stitch shut?" Her words weren't loud, but they were knives, elegant, surgical, aimed precisely where he still bled. He sighed. "So what should I do? Walk away? Pretend I can't help?" She shook her head. "Help, but not like this, not through control. Help by following. Help by listening." "I have listened."
No, you heard, and then you did what you've always done. Acted like a savior.
The words sliced clean. "Savior," she repeated. "You want to fix things your way." But she didn't need saving, and neither do I. What we needed was someone who would stay. Someone who wouldn't disappear the minute the cameras stopped rolling. Shaq stepped forward, rain soaking into his hoodie now. "I didn't come here for cameras." "No," Renita said. "You came for redemption, and now you want to dress it in granite and bronze." The document in her hands crinkled. She held it out to him. "I don't want this. Not like this." He didn't take it. She dropped it on the porch. Rain bled the ink. They stood there for a moment, wordless, while the drizzle worked its way into their shoes, down their backs, into the places where pride and pain hide. Finally, she spoke again. "You want to honor her? Then invest in the living, in the kids who still flinch when sirens pass, in the mothers scared to send their sons to school with questions, in the teachers who fight daily for permission to tell the truth." Shaq's shoulders sagged. "I don't know if I can fix this." Renita walked past him, voice soft again. "Good. That means you finally understand what she carried." He stayed outside after she went in, standing in the rain until his skin prickled. He picked up the soaked paper from the porch, read the now smudged lines of his own generosity, and for the first time since he landed, didn't feel like a giant. He felt human, flawed, responsible. Later that evening, he visited the Eleanor house again, this time without an announcement. He sat with the teens during their writing circle, just listening. He helped fold donation letters in the back office. He stayed for dinner, spaghetti and overboiled corn, and washed dishes until his fingers wrinkled. He didn't make speeches. He didn't write checks. He just stayed. Miss Audra saw him on her way out. She watched him wipe down tables, apron tied awkwardly around his waist. "You finally stepped into the mud," she said with a smile. Shaq looked up. It's where she walked every day, and still kept her shoes clean. That night, Renita left a note on his hotel door. No name, no address, just a folded piece of lined paper. "You can fund the memorial. Just don't call it justice. Justice doesn't have walls. It breathes, like she did. First it burned in fire, then in silence." On the edge of West End, where the sidewalks ended in weeds and the streetlights blinked like tired eyes, stood the charred skeleton of what used to be Mount Calvary AME. The wood had long since blackened, the stained glass shattered, the bell tower sagging like an old man's spine. But the steps were still there, moss-covered and cracked, like they waited for someone to rise again. Shaq hadn't planned to come here. He was on his way to meet a former city archivist who'd reached out anonymously. But something pulled him down this street, a feeling more than a thought, like memory rising uninvited. He stood at the church's edge, watching the blackened beams cast twisted shadows. The story he'd always heard was simple. Electrical fire, a storm knocked out half the grid, lightning hit the roof, the church caught, no one inside. Tragic but random. But now that explanation felt too neat. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. Renita stood at the edge of the sidewalk, arms folded under her coat. Her expression told him she'd been watching for a while. "You came," she said. "I didn't know why until I saw it." Renita nodded toward the wreckage. They rebuilt every church in the area within a year. Except this one. Why? Because they were never planning to. He took a step closer to the building. "This where she gave her last speech?" Renita nodded, to a packed house. Called out half the council by name. Said if they wouldn't protect the community would protect itself. "She say your name?" "No," Renita said. "She said yours." Shaq turned. "What?" Renita pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket and handed it to him. A transcript, photocopied and faded, scrawled at the top in someone else's handwriting. June 10, Mount Calvary, final address. He read the lines slowly. "We've let them convince us that silence is survival. But survival without voice is still dying. You think Shaquille O'Neal made it because he stayed quiet? No. He made it because he had room. He had space. They gave it to him because he wasn't asking questions anymore. And now they use his face like a wall to block everything I say." Shaq lowered the paper. Renita's voice dropped. "She wasn't blaming you, but she knew what they were doing. They made you the symbol, so they could make her the shadow." He swallowed hard. The fire, was it that night? 3 days later. Anyone investigated? Barely. Case closed in a week. Claimed faulty wiring. No rain, no wind, no forensic report released. He clenched the paper in his hand. She recorded herself before she died. She left evidence. She fought. And they erased her, Renita whispered. Later that afternoon, Shaq met the man who had called him through a disposable number, an old city records clerk named Jalen Mott. He was thin, hunched, and spoke with eyes that had seen too much and told too little. They met inside the basement of the same library Shaq had once used to escape the heat as a boy. Now it smelled of mildew and ink. Mott handed over a file, thick, sealed, stamped, internal correspondence, RE Community Control Communications, 2006-2008. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but your name comes up, a lot, especially after the church fire." Shaq opened the file and felt the heat rise off the pages. A memo from a council aide. "Triggs has reached out to O'Neal again. Suggest intercept. Message too direct. Potential risk to current donor image." Another. "Our department flagged Triggs's letters. Redacted before media contact. No delivery confirmed. She believes O'Neal is ignoring her. Maintain that illusion." Another still, dated 1 week before the fire. "Triggs intends to go public with council collusion. O'Neal's brand must remain protected. Reframe narrative as community disruption if necessary." Shaq's pulse roared in his ears. He flipped faster. Then, the last page. Typed at the top, crisis messaging map. Bullet points followed. Precise, cold. O'Neal image, community stability. Triggs narrative, agitator fatigue. Control Shaq's media exposure. Steer toward philanthropy, not activism. Do not inform O'Neal of Triggs' outreach. Silence plausible distance. If fire gains traction, attribute to faulty electrical. No alternate theories allowed to circulate. His hands shook. The betrayal wasn't that he'd forgotten her. It was that they'd made him forget. They built a wall out of his smile, used his silence like mortar, and Eleanor's truth burned underneath it. "You said there was a radio host," Shaq asked quietly. Mott nodded. Name was Clay Lawson. Ran a late-night truth show. Eleanor gave him tapes, letters, recordings, copies of that boombox. A week after the church burned, Clay disappeared. Didn't clean out his locker. Didn't shut off his mail. Just vanished. A police? Called it a personal crisis. Case was shelved. He was never seen again. Shaq closed the file, breathing slowly, deliberately. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you giving me this now?" Mott looked at him. "Because the lie's too heavy now. I've carried it too long. I can't die with her story buried." Back in his hotel that night, Shaq laid the pages out across the bed. Memos, threats, directives, all using his name as a weapon while she was left defenseless. The person who once protected him from bullies, from ignorance, from himself, was betrayed by the very image of him. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at a small photo. Renita had slipped into his coat pocket, Eleanor in front of Mount Calvary, raising her fist to a crowd of teens. Behind her, a hand-painted sign read, "Truth doesn't burn." But it had. And they'd used him to light the match. He stared into the dark for hours, until his thoughts stopped spinning and settled into something harder than guilt: resolve. Tomorrow he wouldn't just speak. He would reveal. She had every reason to break down, but she chose to break silence. The sun was too bright for what the day meant. It beamed down on Jefferson Square like a spotlight that hadn't read the script. The grass was too green, the fountain too clean. The sky, wide and blue, had no intention of mourning. But beneath it all, people gathered. Not for celebration. Not exactly for sorrow either. Something else. Something heavier. Something that had waited too long to be named. Shaq stood to the side of the new podium, heart thudding with the slow rhythm of reckoning. It had taken weeks to build what now stood behind him. The Eleanor Triggs Memorial Wall. Black granite, unpolished, set low, not high. No towering statue. No bronze fist. Just her words engraved in stone. Truth doesn't burn. It multiplies. That decision wasn't his. It was Renita's. He had offered funding. She had offered vision. And in every meeting, every boardroom where politicians tried to twist her into something more palatable, she stood unbending. No branding. No city logo. No corporate endorsements. She didn't want it to be pretty. She wanted it to be undeniable. And today, as the crowd filled in, students, elders, media, old councilmen trying to look supportive, former protesters standing in the back, Renita prepared to speak for the first time, not as someone's granddaughter, but as a voice in her own right. She walked to the podium without notes, no speech in hand, no paper to hide behind, just herself. Shaq watched her, still as stone. She had asked him not to speak. Not yet. This moment, she began, her voice clear and even, isn't for grief. A hush fell. It's not for closure, not for ribbon cutting. It's not to decorate the lie and call it progress. A murmur rustled through the city officials near the front row. She didn't flinch. This wall, she continued, turning slightly to gesture at the memorial behind her, isn't about forgiveness. It's about the truth. My grandmother didn't die of age or wear or some quiet sadness. She died from being buried alive, by policies, by silence, by the kind of cowardice that wears suits and calls itself structure. There was no applause yet, no claps, just stunned stillness. They burned down the church where she spoke, Renita said, voice rising. They erased her name from school walls, redirected her letters, made a hero out of a man who didn't even know he was being used to hide her. Shaq felt that line land like a freight train, but didn't move. He had already accepted the role. He was no longer afraid of the weight. But you know what she taught me? Renita went on. Not to beg. Not to perform grief for people who only listen when it's pretty. She paused, breathing steady. I haven't cried today, and I won't. Not because I don't feel the loss, but because she deserves more than tears. Now slowly the silence broke into something else. Attention turning electric. The crowd leaned in. I won't cry because she didn't, Renita said. Not when they came for her job. Not when they sabotaged her activism. Not when the tapes she recorded never made it to court. Not when her last protest turned into whispers behind closed doors. She looked across the square, eyes scanning the faces. The ones who came in guilt. The ones in admiration. The ones in fear. I won't cry because she lived with fire, not pity. And fire doesn't weep, it spreads. Shaq felt a knot in his chest swell and snap. Not from sadness, but awe. This wasn't a tribute, it was an ignition. She stood up when it was inconvenient, when it cost her everything. And some of you, she turned directly to the local officials seated in the front row, stood by and said nothing. Or worse, smiled for cameras while pulling strings behind curtains. A few glanced away. One woman whispered to another, but neither responded publicly. And to the ones who told me she should have waited her turn, or found a less combative way, this is your turn now. Your turn to sit and listen while a black girl with no podium money, no title, no endorsements tells the story you tried to unwrite. Someone in the back shouted, "Say that again." Others clapped, brief and sharp. But Renita raised her hand, silencing it.
This isn't a performance, she said. This is a reckoning.
She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small audio player. Old, cracked, familiar.
This is her voice, she said. One of the last recordings she made.
She placed the player on the podium. Pressed play. Eleanor's voice came through, weathered but unshakable. If you're hearing this, I probably didn't get the chance to finish what I started. That's okay. I didn't expect to. But I want you to know they didn't win. Not if you're still listening. Not if you're still speaking. The crowd stood still, eyes glossy. Breaths held. Renita pressed pause. That was her gospel. Not pain, but persistence. Not fame, but fight. Not legacy, but living truth. She stepped back from the podium, looked at the crowd once more. I don't need you to cry. I need you to remember, and then do something with it. And then she walked away. No fanfare, no lingering. She left the microphone like it was never hers to keep. People didn't clap immediately. Some wept, silently. Some stood, hands folded, unsure of what to do with what they just witnessed. But one thing became clear. Something had shifted. Shaq remained in the same place, his hands clasped behind him, taller than everyone and yet suddenly profoundly small. The kind of small that comes when you finally understand you were never the center of the story. You were just someone lucky enough to stand near it. He walked over to Renita after a while. She was by the side of the memorial now, tracing her fingers along the words. You didn't cry, he said gently. She looked at him. Neither did she. He nodded, eyes glinting. But I might. She smirked faintly. That's your burden. And somehow, it didn't feel cruel. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the space around the wall remained charged, like the ghost of Eleanor had risen just enough to exhale. Later that night, news coverage of the speech flooded social media. Clips of Renita's words went viral. Talk shows debated them. Politicians scrambled to draft new statements. But none of it mattered more than what happened next. A girl who wouldn't cry had made a city speak. And the silence, at last, had cracked. Sometimes, home isn't where you were born. It's where you ask for forgiveness. The last time Shaq had stood on the cracked pavement outside 83 Walton Street, he was 17 and angry, backpack slung over one shoulder, head full of scholarship dreams and escape plans. He didn't turn around then, didn't look back at the house where his aunt raised him, the porch where he and Eleanor argued about revolution and mixtapes. He had told himself he'd outgrown this place. Now, decades later, the same street felt heavier, older, and more honest. No filters, no fanfare, just West End as it had always been, flawed, alive, and full of ghosts. The house itself hadn't collapsed, but it leaned like it wanted to. Shaq ran a hand along the splintered porch rail, paint chipped under his fingers. The screen door hung off one hinge. A faded sticker still clung to the mailbox. Register to vote, stay woke. He walked inside, the air smelling of old wood, plaster, and the faint memory of lemon-scented floor polish. It was empty now, furniture long gone, but the bones remained. The slanted living room floor, the kitchen window facing the alley, the patch in the ceiling where rain used to sneak through in spring. He took off his shoes, not out of habit, but out of reverence. Even silence deserved respect here. That night, he didn't sleep in a hotel. He slept on the floor, beneath the crooked ceiling fan, wrapped in a blanket Miss Audra had dropped off without asking. The hum of the neighborhood drifted through the window, dogs barking, kids arguing about a game, the occasional bass thump of a passing car. He smiled. It was a song he hadn't heard in years. The next morning, he made a decision. No more flights, no more speeches, no press junkets. He wasn't going back to LA, not yet, maybe not ever. He wasn't here to repair an image. He was here to live in what had been broken. He started with the house. The work was slow, manual, and stubborn. He didn't hire a crew. He borrowed tools from the community center and took advice from neighbors who still remembered him as that tall boy with the wild jump shot and the quiet mama. Mr. Boyd helped him replace the floorboards. Renita showed him how to patch drywall. And when he bent down to sweep the porch for the third time that week, someone across the street muttered, "A millionaire in work boots, what a time." Shaq didn't respond. He just kept sweeping. He spent his days walking with neighborhood kids to school, sitting in on classrooms, offering to tutor math where needed. He read books in the back of the Eleanor house, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. At night he helped package meals, his hands learning the rhythms of chopping, sealing, labeling. He didn't give speeches anymore. He gave time. At first the neighborhood didn't know what to do with him. People assumed it was temporary, a publicity stunt stretched out longer than expected. But weeks turned into months. And then one day nobody flinched when he walked into the corner store in paint-streaked jeans to grab an Arizona iced tea and a loaf of bread. They just said, "Mornin', Shaq," and kept moving. The shift was subtle but real. He had stopped being a symbol. He had started being a neighbor. And yet, it wasn't simple. Some wounds didn't heal with effort alone. One afternoon, he found a letter taped to the Eleanor house door. It read, "All this time, and now you want to care? Your money bought murals. It didn't buy memory. Some of us still remember who you didn't show up for. He kept the letter, folded it neatly, placed it on the mantel of the house. It belonged there, not as shame, but as truth. Every piece of his absence had weight, and he wasn't here to erase it. He was here to carry it. Months passed. One morning, Renita arrived at the house, arms full of old photo albums, her face unreadable. "I figured this belonged here," she said. Shaq took the albums and laid them out on the floor. Pictures of Eleanor flooded the pages, at rallies, with students, laughing on a porch step, face fierce in front of microphones, and between those pages, photos of Shaq too, younger, uncertain, always looking towards something just out of frame. "She loved you," Renita said, "even when you didn't call back." He nodded slowly. "I know. She forgave you, long before you asked." "I'm still asking," he said. Renita smiled, but only slightly. "Keep showing up, that's the answer." Together they built out a new wing at the Eleanor house. Not a memorial, but a community archive. Renita called it the listening room. It housed testimonies, recordings, letters, even student essays inspired by Eleanor's life. People contributed freely. Elders recorded oral histories. Teens digitized footage from dusty VHS tapes. It became a heartbeat of the neighborhood, a place where truth wasn't framed behind glass but spoken aloud. And through it all, Shaq stayed. He became the one they called when the ceiling leaked or the garden needed tilling. He mentored high schoolers, taught them how to manage a bank account, and sat in courtrooms to advocate for young men caught in systems Eleanor had fought her whole life to dismantle. He didn't ask for attention. He earned trust, one quiet moment at a time. One afternoon, while fixing the community basketball hoop, a kid named Lennox asked, "Why you still here?" Shaq looked up from the wrench in his hand. Lennox pointed toward the skyline. "You could be anywhere. Miami, New York, on TV." Shaq smiled. "Because everywhere else felt borrowed. This feels earned." That night, as he walked home past Mount Calvary's ruins, he stopped by the brick pile where the steps once stood. Someone had placed flowers there, fresh, fragrant, with a small note tucked underneath. He opened it. It read, "You made it back. She'd be proud." He didn't know who left it. He didn't need to. He sat on the last unburned stone and watched the sky fade to indigo, streetlights flickering to life one by one. And for the first time in a long time, Shaquille O'Neal felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not peace, but home. She said 10 words that rewrote everything he thought he knew. The room was small, just 4 phone panels on each wall, a desk made from reclaimed plywood, a second-hand mic with a faint buzz when it got too close to metal, the kind of space built not for show, but for stories. It didn't need polish, it needed honesty. Shaq sat across from Renita in a mismatched chair that creaked every time he shifted. The air held that usual low hum of old electronics and quiet nerves. He glanced at the rundown laptop balanced on a cinderblock shelf beside them, the waveform already tracking. The red light blinked steady. "You ready?" he asked. Renita nodded, her fingers gently adjusting the mic. "Yeah, hit record." He clicked the spacebar. A soft beep, then silence. Then her voice. "My name is Renita Triggs. I'm the granddaughter of Eleanor Triggs, and I've waited a long time to be heard." No hesitation, no preamble, no filter. Shaq leaned back, letting her words wash over him. This was her first time recording, but she didn't need media training. She had inherited something better, clarity. She wasn't perfect, Renita said. She was tired, loud, stubborn. She didn't always say things kindly, but she said them when they needed to be said, and that's more than most people can claim. The mic picked up the slight break in her voice, the inhale she caught just before it cracked. But she didn't fall apart. She adjusted, kept going. She used to say, "Silence is a coat they make you wear, so you forget what skin feels like." And she never wore that coat, even when they tried to make her, even when they told her no one was listening. Shaq closed his eyes. The room felt warmer suddenly. "I watched her get ignored by the very people who called her a pillar when she died. I watched grown men avoid her eyes in meetings, watched them praise others for repeating what she had shouted for decades." There was no rage in Renita's voice, just weariness and control. "I want people to know she didn't die bitter. She died tired. She died carrying too much weight while too many of you stayed light." Shaq didn't interrupt. This wasn't about him. Not yet. Renita paused and leaned closer to the mic. They called her angry, but she wasn't. She was in love, with truth, with justice, with people too broken to love themselves. That kind of love looks like fury from the outside. Shaq opened his eyes again. She was staring at the waveform now, watching the sound ripple across the screen like waves she couldn't take back. He leaned forward and spoke, finally. What would she say now, if she saw all of this? Renita looked up at him for the first time since they started. She'd laugh. Laugh? Yeah, that dry laugh she did when she saw people suddenly acting like they cared. She never believed in sudden change, but she believed in slow fires. Shaq smiled, but it didn't hold. He clicked pause. Not to stop her, but to breathe. He looked at her. Can I ask you something not for the mic? She tilted her head. You already did. What did she say about me, in private? Renita didn't answer immediately. She folded her hands, the same way Eleanor used to do during tense meetings, one palm gripping the other like it was keeping a secret. Then she said it. She never hated you. She just needed you to listen. 10 words. That was all. 10 simple words that detonated every defense Shaq had spent years building. All the justifications, the excuses, the noise. They collapsed under the weight of something heavier than guilt. Love. Unspoken. Undemanding. Unpaid. She hadn't hated him. Not even after the letters went undelivered. Not after the mural replaced her face. Not after the fire. She had just wanted him to listen. Shaq turned away, hand to his face, and finally, he wept. The tears came without drama. No shuddering, no gasps, just steady drops cutting down the cheek of a man the world thought didn't break. A man they called unshakable. Renita didn't comfort him, didn't move. She just sat, watching him cry in the same silence that once swallowed her grandmother's voice. When he finally looked back at her, eyes raw, voice barely audible, he said, I should have come back sooner. She didn't nod. She didn't correct him. She simply said, but you came back. That night they played the recording again, editing nothing. They didn't clip the stumbles, didn't soften the tone. They let the episode breathe. Truth doesn't need polish.
They titled it The Girl Who Watched Her Grandmother Burn Bright.
It was released the next morning. By noon, it had 20,000 downloads. By midnight, it hit every trending list. But Shaq didn't watch the numbers. He didn't post about it. He didn't call a press team. He stood in front of Eleanor's memorial that night. Just him and the stone, the streetlight flickering above like a faulty halo. He touched her engraved name and whispered, I'm listening now. And this time, silence wasn't emptiness. It was an answer. If this story made you pause, let it push you further. Speak the names they tried to erase. Ask the questions that make rooms uncomfortable. Don't just remember, respond. Because silence doesn't preserve history, it buries it. And truth only lives when we refuse to let it die.